The young soldier was lying on the bed, his arms thrown over his eyes, his bootless feet dangling over one end. The tall soldier was sitting near the fire, which he had managed to light, his head nodding as he tried to fend off sleep. The old one, who had entered ahead of Jonathan, had taken his place at the table and had already started to work on his pipe, trying to light it. The pipe was like a toy in his large hands. Jonathan, the boy at his side, stood by the door and looked in. He could feel the press of his rising anger. The soldier's callousness gave more and more strength to his conviction that they had been party to the killing. But even as he believed it, he did not want to believe it. He wanted yearningly to give them a chance to prove him wrong. "They need to be buried," he said out loud. None of the soldiers paid any attention. The old soldier puffed a cloud of smoke. Jonathan went where the young soldier lay. "They need to be buried," he repeated. "I can't do it alone." When the young soldier gave no response, Jonathan put out a hand and tentatively shook the man's arm. The Hessian swatted at him and rolled over so that his back was to Jonathan. Hurt by the rebuff, Jonathan turned around. The tall soldier was now stretched out full length, asleep. Only the old soldier was awake. For a long while Jonathan stood there, trying to calm his thoughts, which pulled him first one way, then another. "Did you do it?" he suddenly blurted out. The old soldier puffed his pipe. Behind the smoke, the expression on his face seemed lost, vague, absent. Seething, Jonathan turned abruptly and grabbed the shovel that was by the door. He held it up so the soldier would see it. "I'm going to bury them," he said. For a moment the old soldier's eyes looked up, but then became indifferent again. Jonathan took the boy's hand and returned to where the bodies lay. The boy watched intently, but whether he understood what was about to happen, Jonathan could not tell. Jonathan began to dig alongside the couple, as if he were trying to burst the ground open. The thickly knotted roots and dull shovel blade conspired against him. In rage, he chopped into the earth. Then, desperately trying to control himself, he recollected how he had worked his father's fields. Pressing his foot against the top of the shovel, he flung his full weight down onto it, forcing the blade into the earth. He dug more and more furiously as the ground began to give way, and the little boy watched. 7:35. Jonathan dug until he could not dig any more, yet he knew the grave was too narrow and not nearly deep enough. The boy, his head resting on his mother's hair, had fallen asleep. Jonathan knew he had to get help. He was exhausted and covered with a damp, unclean sweat. He could do no more. He returned to the house, shovel in hand, his fury unspent. In the house it was as before, only the old one was awake. He was sitting with his big feet up on the table. Crumbs from the loaf of bread were before him. The cup lay in a small pool of blue-white milk. The bucket was almost empty. "I need some help," Jonathan said brusquely. He held up the shovel. Gradually the soldier lifted his head and stared at Jonathan. His face took Jonathan by surprise. He hadn't fully realized until then, how old the man was. It was as if the fierce mustache was a disguise. Now he saw that much of his hair was gray, and the day-old stubble of whitish beard on his face made him seem older yet. His eyes were tired. "I can't do it myself," said Jonathan, suddenly feeling defeated. "I need help," he repeated, pleading. Slowly, stiffly, the man got up and went over to where the young soldier was sleeping. He shook him hard and spoke sharply. The young soldier sat up, looking first at the old soldier and then at Jonathan. Again the old soldier spoke. To Jonathan it sounded as if he was giving commands. Sullenly, the young soldier swung about, groped for his boots, and pulled them on. Jonathan, shovel in hand, stood by the door, waiting. Staggering slightly from sleepiness, the young soldier came to the door. He looked out and saw that it had become dark. He went back to catch up a burning brand from the fire. Torch held high, the Hessian followed Jonathan. It wasn't a bright flame, only a feeble orange light, fussing and spitting in the damp air. It seemed to make the darkness darker. 7:40. Jonathan led the way. He found the boy where he had left him, asleep beside his parents. The young soldier stopped and looked at what Jonathan had done. Speaking sharply with obvious disgust, he thrust the burning stick into Jonathan's hand and snatched up the shovel. Jonathan, terrified for a moment that the soldier was going to strike him, jumped back. But the young soldier only stood in the shallow grave and began to dig hurriedly, throwing out the dirt while talking in muttering tones to himself, and giving Jonathan angry looks. Jonathan's own anger returned. He stood stonily by. While the young soldier tired, which was soon, he flipped the shovel to Jonathan and climbed out. Jonathan let himself down into the grave and began to dig again, but the young soldier impatiently jumped back in, took back the shovel, and fairly flung Jonathan out of the way. Das genügt, the Hessian finally said, with a dusting of his hands. Throwing the shovel out, he hauled himself up. Jonathan went to the boy and gently tried to rouse him. At first he would not waken, until, with a jerk of his head, he sat up, shying from Jonathan's touch. The boy's eyes moved from him to the young soldier and widened. Jonathan looked around. The young soldier was holding the burning stick high, making the shadow on his face grow long and severe, as if his head had been stretched. Jonathan saw him in a new way, powerful and evil. The Hessian stuck the stick into the ground so it stood like a candle. Then he went to the man's feet. "Hot in face," he said curtly to Jonathan. Jonathan went to the man's arms. After a moment's hesitation, he braced himself and gripped the man's wrists. The skin was cold and stiff. The boy, sitting on the ground, watched, wide-eyed. First, they turned the man into the grave. Then they moved the woman. She rolled in, landing upon the man on her back. For the first time, Jonathan saw her face. Her mouth was open, her eyes closed, her sallow face smeared with dirt. Her teeth were large and crooked, eye teeth missing. Her bloodless lips were drawn back, and Jonathan could see her tongue. It was black. "Las Bildit," the young soldier commanded. He reached down and grabbed a handful of dirt, which he tossed on the couple. Then he pointed at Jonathan and made hurried motions with his hands. Jonathan reluctantly picked up the shovel. Taking earth from the pile that had been made, he began to cover the bodies. When the dirt hit the woman's face and went into her open mouth, he stopped, trying to catch his breath. Then he turned and retched. Trembling, he turned back to the grave. The young soldier grabbed the shovel from him and flung in the rest of the dirt. Jonathan stood aside, ashamed. When the grave was filled, the young soldier tossed the shovel aside and pointed to the watching boy, making a rising gesture with his hand. Jonathan crossed over and pulled the boy to his feet. This time the boy came willingly and stood close by. But when Jonathan tried to take his hand, he snatched it away and made a fist. Jonathan fought back tears. It was for his own sake he wished to hold the boy's hand. The young soldier closed two of his jacket buttons and touched his thin mustache as if to straighten it, an imitation of the gesture Jonathan had seen the old soldier make many times. Then, standing a little straighter, the soldier began to speak. Because of the sing-song cadence, Jonathan sensed it was a prayer and wished he knew its meaning. Finishing quickly, all too quickly in Jonathan's judgment, the young soldier wiped his hands on his jacket, then picking up the torch, made a motion to Jonathan that they were to return to the house. Jonathan looked over his shoulder. He could see the glowing oil paper window. When he bent over to pick up the boy resisted. but this time Jonathan clung to him, knowing that he needed to hold the child. The young soldier started off. Jonathan followed, feeling the soft, steady, and comforting breathing of the boy against his neck. Once in the house, Jonathan set the boy on the floor. The young soldier went straight to where he had been before, pulled off his boots, and lay down. Within moments, he was asleep. The tall soldier sprawled before the fire, his long body stretched full length, and his head cradled in one arm. His other fisted hand was pressed against his mouth like a child's. Occasionally he snored. The old soldier remained awake. Sitting on the ground, he had wedged himself into a corner, pipe in hand. From it, a thin line of smoke rose. He seemed to deliberately avoid looking at Jonathan or the boy. Jonathan looked at the soldiers, feeling miserable and bitter. Then he poured out the last cup of milk and gave it to the boy, who, holding the cup in two hands, drained it slowly. When he was done, he gave the cup back, then gazed about it as if in search of something. After a moment, he pointed across the room and tugged at Jonathan's leg. At first, Jonathan wasn't sure what he wanted. Then he saw there was a long, box-like object under the young soldier's bed. Jonathan pulled it out. The box contained a linen sack filled with straw. There was also a blanket. It was the boy's bed. The boy helped him drag it along the floor, guiding it until it sat directly under the table. The boy got in. Turning on his side, he pulled the blanket up and simply lay there, staring at the side of the box. Jonathan watched, then he reached in and briefly touched the nape of the boy's neck, where the hair was soft. The boy shifted slightly, then lay still. Jonathan stood up. Once again he glanced about the room, his eyes meeting the old soldier's. The Hessian beckoned to him. As Jonathan nervously approached him, he realized that the Hessian was holding the rope. As soon as Jonathan was close enough, the Hessian leaned forward and quickly tied the rope around Jonathan's ankles, then tied a tight knot. Jonathan saw that the other end of the rope was fastened to the soldier's ankle. The old soldier shifted about and smoked his pipe indifferently. Jonathan suddenly felt his own weariness. He sat down as far away from the Hessian as the rope would allow, and with his back to him. He looked down at the rope, which pinched tightly. In a glance, he saw that it was a knot he could untie. He felt his heart begin to beat rapidly. He quickly glanced about the room. The old soldier's head was now bent back against the wall, his chest moving with a deep rhythm of sleep. His mouth was slightly agape. From his hand the pipe dangled and then fell, spilling sparks of red ash, so that for a moment the earth floor glowed like a deep star-filled sky. Jonathan studied the other sleeping men. He swung about on his knees and saw the boy, who was also asleep. Keeping an eye on the old soldier, Jonathan tentatively plucked at the rope that held him. Then, working with increasing sureness, he looked down and used both hands. The knot fell open. Jonathan stood up, listening to the night sounds, peepers, an owl, the scurrying of something on the roof above. He remained motionless, as if waiting for something to happen. Gradually, it came to him that he could do anything he chose to do. The soldiers, all asleep, were powerless. He could, he knew, simply walk away and be free. He could stay there and be their prisoner. Or, he realized with a quickening sense of dread, he could do what any true soldier would do. He could kill them.